on my last cruise by doing the opposite of what I used to recommend. Instead of hanging around for ages, I instead sailed through check-in and was on board and in my cabin within 15 minutes of getting to the port. It got me thinking about how many other tried and tested tips that I and other cruise creators have suggested for ages also no longer work. Welcome aboard, I'm Gary Bembridge, and before I get to that embarkation day tip that I no longer recommend, I want to talk about another tip that could be costing you dearly. Let me explain. For years, it made sense to wait until the last minute to book a cruise because you could save a fortune as lines cut fares to ensure their ships sailed full, because they make a significant amount of their profits from the onboard spend. However, this no longer applies for most cruise lines and major cruising regions like the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, and even Alaska, because demand for cruising has rocketed, especially by attracting more first-timers and, of course, more families. On average, every cruising group says their ships are sailing over capacity. Ship capacity is defined by double occupancy. Because 3 or 4 people, mostly families, are increasingly sharing cabins, ships are sailing over capacity consistently. There are rarely cabins they're looking to clear last minute at bargain rates. So waiting for last minute deals is less likely to save you money these days. In fact, the best prices you get these days is by booking when cruises come on sale. This is when the fares are cheapest, and now, largely speaking, prices will keep moving up from then onwards. However, if you don't want to book early, are flexible, and want to try to get better prices closer to sailing, there are 2 key things that I now recommend you do. Look for flash sales. They often run over a weekend, and particularly at the end of a quarter, where cruise lines are trying to make sure they hit their sales targets. For example, as I make this, Celebrity is offering 60% off second person, and Virgin Voyages 80% off second person for 3 days. And Silversea is offering 45% off selected sailings on a flash sale. I look for flash sales on social media like Instagram and Facebook, where all of these showed up on my feed, and also by signing for cruise line emails to be sent. Secondly, if you do book early, do fare tracking. And if prices do fall, you can push if you haven't paid final payment for a fare change or upgrade, so your cabin matches the new fare. If after final payment, you then can push to get onboard credit or an upgrade. Now, some lines are more accommodating than others, but do try. I have a post on my blog showing how to do this on sites like Cruise Critic, Cruise Watch, and Cruise Line, and there are now some Google Chrome extensions like the one from allaboarddeals.com that show you pricing trends when you search for cruises and will then alert you of changes. You can find out more about all of this in terms of fare tracking at tipsfortravelers.com/fare tracking. What about that tip around embarkation day that I spoke about earlier though? If cruise lines offer the ability to book the earliest available slot on embarkation day, I used to recommend doing that. And if there's no set time, I always used to suggest arriving as early as possible to get on board the ship, explore it, and of course have lunch on board. However, with a few exceptions like Virgin Voyages and sometimes Cunard, most cruise lines do not enforce booked or allocated check-in slots at all. For example, on my recent Holland America Zaandam cruise out of Miami, they had sent out check-in times based on deck level. However, they also happened to mention that check-in desks were opening from 11 a.m. for the first allocation. So pretty much everybody arrived at that time anyway, leading to long lines to get to the terminal for check-in and hanging around waiting to board. However, arriving from 1:30 p.m. onwards, there were no lines. It took minutes to do the process and board. It also meant that cabins were available to go to, so no waiting around for them to be ready. These days, I tend to no longer use a tip to get there early. I arrive later, but of course well before final check-in and all aboard time, which is normally about an hour before the ship is due to sail. Instead of standing in lines, sitting at the port and hanging around for my cabin to be ready, I now use that time to have a more leisurely breakfast and enjoy whichever city that I am in. For example, before a Symphony of the Seas cruise from Barcelona recently, I booked and went to the famous Sagrada Familia Church, and I had a bite to eat on the Ramblas. I arrived at the port to no lines, and I could get straight into my cabin because they were now available. Of course though, I still follow the tip to get to my cruise departure city at least one day before and for long haul even more to get into the time zone, go sightseeing, and to have a few days buffer if there are major flight disruptions, which seem frequent from weather storms and conflicts these days. I used to recommend against sticking with one cruise line to build status on their loyalty program, but I've now changed my mind on this. Why have I done that? It takes a lot of cruises to get to a tier with any meaningful perks. Perks are not that impressive overall anyway, and it may cost you both money and opportunities. And sticking with one line means that you're limited by where they're going, on what ships, and at their fares. And I argue that you may be missing a better itinerary and a better fare by moving between lines. That's what I used to recommend. However, there now is a case to be made for being loyal to at least one line, but only if you make some strategic choices. The reason being, cruising is increasingly offering status matching. That means if you've built loyalty with one line, you can unlock perks when cruising on a different line. For example, with Royal Caribbean Group, you can match your loyalty level from any of their three lines, Royal Caribbean, Celebrity, or Silversea, if you sail on any one of those three. So, for example, I had high status on Celebrity, and so when I traveled on Royal Caribbean, having never cruised with them before, I was matched to their pretty high diamond level status despite never having been on them. This unlocked things like 4 free drinks vouchers a day, access to the Diamond Lounge, priority check-in, and so on. Then when I went on Silversea, it gave me status matching, which unlocked perks like free laundry, for example. And if you don't have high status with any one of the Royal Caribbean group lines, they now give you opportunity to select which of your loyalty programs, Royal Caribbean, Celebrity, or Silversea, that your points get allocated to when sailing on any of them. So you can actually build status on just one of those lines to get to a high status, even if you're moving between the different Royal Caribbean lines. And you can then, once you've got that status, leverage it across the others. Another group doing status matching is Norwegian Group. Thanks to my status on Regent, I unlocked gold status on my recent Oceania Riviera cruise, which gave me $650 in onboard credit. I'll also be using that to status match for my Norwegian Aqua cruise in a few months. Another reason for building status on one line these days is you can now use that to unlock status perks on other lines across competitive cruise lines. For example, MSC Cruises and Explorer Journeys status matched my high Regent status when I cruised on them, as has Virgin Voyages for my Brilliant Lady Caribbean cruise later this year. However, at the time of making this, the Carnival Corporation and their lines, so for example, Carnival, Princess, Holland America, Seabourn, and Cunard, they do not status match between the different lines nor with any other line. And as they say, they have no plans to do status matching. When thinking of building status, a strategic choice may be to focus on a line in the other groups. So there is a case for ignoring my older tip about not building loyalty on a line, because it can now unlock perks across a multitude of lines, both within a group and competitive lines. One tip that I'd stuck to for a very long time was around cruise line excursions. Cruise lines say the ship will almost always wait if any of their excursions are delayed for any reason. They also claim that they've screened the providers, and as it's linked to the cruise line, if you have any complaints, you have the cruise line there to sort them out. However, I've shifted away from them as their cruise line excursions are getting really expensive, and with ships sailing so full, often they can be sold out way in advance. For example, I've booked a repositioning cruise going from Papeete via Hawaii onto Vancouver in 15 months' time, but already several of the must-do excursions I was keen on are sold out. I find cruise line excursions in regions like Alaska and parts of the Mediterranean are also often sold out way in advance. For example, that Zaidam cruise I was talking about from Miami to San Diego by the Panama Canal, most of the many popular excursions were completely sold out months before the trip. So now I do more independent tours these days. I mostly use shoreexcursionsgroup.com, where if you do use them, by the way, use the code TFT5 at checkout to get a 5% discount on top of any other promotions they may be running. And I also like to use ventureashore.com. As well as offering lower priced and smaller groups, the two reasons that I like those two is first, I can input my cruise line, my ship, and the dates, and it will bring me up all the excursions port by port that they offer. And second, They both guarantee to get me back to the cruise ship in plenty of time, or they will arrange and cover costs to get me to the next port. Viator.com is another good one, as is tourspylocals.com if you want more local and self-employed tour providers. But if these are the tips that I no longer recommend, there are some rather offbeat cruise tips that I still swear by, ones that you probably haven't heard of before. So join me over in this video where I explain how they can work for you too. See you over there.